It's
a really hard name for us to pronounce. So how do we do it?
Okay. Stückenschneider. Stückenschneider.
Stückenschneider. Okay.
Stückenschneider.
Okay. Olá a todos e a todas, é um prazer estar com vocês aqui em mais essa live do Grupo de Estudos Olímpicos, nessa tarde de quarta-feira. Aqui em Campos do Jordão chove bastante, felizmente, e hoje é um dia bastante especial para nós, porque nós temos também um convidado bastante especial. Está aqui conosco hoje Maurice Stückenschneider.
Stückenschneider. Almost.
Thank you, Maurice. Para quem não conhece, ele foi jogador profissional de League of Legends, participou de 2 campeonatos mundiais e hoje ele é um técnico, é um preparador, é um mestre de League of Legends, preparando novas gerações. Na nossa pauta hoje estão eSport é esporte, cyberatleta é atleta. Será que os eSports entram no programa olímpico? E para conduzir essa live para lá de especial, nós temos aqui hoje Toshi Nishida, que é formado em mídias digitais e é também um editor de streaming. Gabriel Savonitti, que é doutorando em Educação Física pela Universidade de São Paulo. Nós temos aqui o Guilherme Souza Vieira, que é mestre em Games pela PUC de São Paulo. E temos também aqui o professor Raoni Machado, da Universidade Federal de Lavras. Hello, Maurice. Thank you very much for your collaboration with us in this moment. And let's start the game.
Sure, we can do that.
Vamos lá, Toshi, it's you.
Hello. We have here with us today Maurice, also known on the League of Legends community as Amazing. So please, if you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Maurice Amazing Stückenschneider. I've been a professional League of Legends player for now over 8 years. Recently turned to become a coach this year for Misfits in the EU LEC. And I've been to 2 World Championships. I think that's we've already said that. I'm not sure, but yeah, I've basically been playing League for a long time, and have basically been an esports athlete for a long time.
All right. Now we have a list of topics, and each of our members here will ask you a few of them that relates a little more with how we go about it. So first we start with who's first? Well, let's go. First, could you tell us your story on relating with sports, how you started playing video games, how you became competitive about it, where you start by, how you got to the pro level, and your evolution through it until today?
So I've always been playing competitive sports in some kind of way. So I'm not new to the competitive side of things. I started playing football when I was 6 years old, or I think maybe even earlier. Started playing basketball when I was 14. And for some reason, at some point when I was 15, 16, I really got into almost competitive gaming, I would suppose. I was always a gamer to a certain extent, where I had like some video games, especially on the PS1, PS2, and then I later on changed to the PC. And when I was 15, I discovered Counter-Strike. I don't know if you guys know Counter-Strike Source, but at the time it was pretty big, and I became pretty competitive at it, just as I was with Modern Warfare at the time, Call of Duty. And when League of Legends became big, I started playing it a lot more. And despite me being terrible at the beginning, like awful at the beginning, I somehow persevered and became better and better. Where when I was 18, I was actually able to join a team that was then considered a semi-pro team, and then I became a semi-pro player. When I was 18, 19, and was 20, I joined the LCS at the time with the Copenhagen Wolves. Then changed over to North America, where I played for TSM, and then afterwards, I guess the rest is history. But overall, it's basically been like something over the last 6 years. I've basically been playing in the LEC as a full-time professional, and have recently turned coach, and it's been a hell of a ride. Let's put it this way. It's been really, really interesting. The competitive side of gaming is something to behold. You really like, it's so different to the competitive side of actually like sports, and it's really something interesting.
All right. So to hook it from there, can you tell us a bit of the challenges you faced as a pro player and how they changed for the current and upcoming players?
Yeah. So, when I started my esports career, the salaries weren't that high, so it was actually more or less a hobby that was supported by a bit of money. So it's supposed like a part-time job to a certain extent, so people couldn't really sustain themselves. As the scene progressed, there was more and more money involved, and at some point people could support themselves. And when that happened, I think the challenges changed, where in the beginning it was like more of a challenge, an existential challenge, where people had to basically make a living out of it and figure out how to do it. And when that was figured out, I think the challenges changed, where people then had to figure out how to become the very best. Like, how do I support myself over the long term? How to become like someone that can win multiple championships? So I think it actually became like, it changed from being an existential, more or less like question, to an actual competitive question, where you basically became a competitor instead of just having to play for your livelihood, I suppose. And recently, I think in the last couple of years, I think that has actually extended, and now people are actually making not just a living, but making a future out of it. So I think money-wise, everyone is fine nowadays. They're all happy. They don't have to think about that anymore. But what they have to think about now is how to make this a future kind of oriented topic, where how they support their future families, whatever it is, and how they can like actually stay at the top for the longest time being, I suppose.
All right. And can you tell us about a bit about like how you entered, how you like began your career? So we know that the teams you're past,
Yep.
but like how was growing on it? Because on the beginning it was existential,
Yeah.
and now it's easier.
Yeah.
But like, how to put it?
I think I know where you're going. Like, it was it was a really wild time. Let's put it this way. So when I started out, I had zero plans about actually becoming a competitive gamer. There was no incentive for me whatsoever. But when I joined my first competitive team, it was more or less for fun. There was nothing, like, there was no monetary incentive for me. I didn't think about, hey, I can earn money with this. It was just playing for fun. So that kept growing, and at some point, like, small leagues were opened up where suddenly you could make like 50 euros, 100 euros for a weekend, whatever it is. And then that kept on growing. And at some point, when I had my first paycheck, so to speak, which was at the time, it was very little, but it still felt a lot for an 18-year-old. Suddenly I realized, hey, there's more to this than just like the fun side of the competition. And I grew into it. And I suppose a lot of players back in the days, they kind of just spammed the game. So what I mean by that, they just kept playing the game, kept playing the big game, and they became good at it. And that's how they became good at it. There was nothing else behind it. They just played a lot. That's why they became good. And then suddenly they ended up in competitive leagues and suddenly earned a decent amount of living, suddenly became like people that travel around the world. And for me, my first experience traveling around the world was actually in 2012, when I was invited with my team, Acer at the time, to a event in China, and I've never traveled for anything outside of Europe before, and suddenly I was invited to a game or to a event in China, and that experience really opened the world up to me, and it's still one of my fondest memories, and it's still one of the craziest memories ever, because suddenly I find myself playing in front of 1,000 people in China, even though I never played in front of anyone or anything but my parents, maybe, or my siblings online. So it was really, really interesting.
All right. We are starting to get a few questions on the chat, but I'll leave it for later. Not now. Let's just go with those topics, and I'll ask the questions in a moment.
Okay.
You lived through this growth of the esports in general, going from something more like high skill cap hobby to a profession. You went through this transition mostly through League of Legends, right?
Yeah.
So nowadays we got some games that have very well established esports community. I would say mostly CS:GO and Dota at this point, together with League. This is the triad of the esports.
Yeah, Overwatch and Overwatch and Modern Warfare actually have like a pretty established community too at this point. Yeah. But yeah, I agree.
And living in these games, different from sports, are something that come and go. There are new releases all the time, and a lot of big companies that are trying to establish their own games as esports. How do you see this? How much new game influences the esports environment? Like, do you think it's a temptation for the current players to just transition to something new, to strive for being the top on that new platform, or is it more viable to stay on something stable like the already established CS:GO, Dota, Overwatch, League, etc.?
So I think it entirely depends on your position within the scene. For me, for example, it would not make sense because partially I'm old, like I'm 26 at this point, so transitioning to another game may not be the smartest choice, but it's also dependent on whether or not those skills transfer. Because I mean, going from to kind of give a reference, like if you go from football to basketball, that's pretty hard. And I think some esports are slightly more overlapping than, like, I guess the difference between football and basketball. For example, Fortnite has like certain abilities that you can transfer to other games, like for example to other shooters or whatever it is. But in terms of MOBAs, like I think the only transfer is like from Dota to potentially League of Legends. Even the other way around would be pretty hard. So there is some temptation, but it entirely depends on your financial incentive, your financial backing, how comfortable you feel to do this. So, for example, Valorant, which is now the new Riot game or the new Tencent game, I suppose, a lot of players from other like games actually transferred over to Valorant, but it's basically been players that have been used to shooters already. So people like from the CS:GO scene, someone from the Modern Warfare, from the Call of Duty scene. So I suppose there's some incentive there, but the temptation is relatively limited, and I suppose it's also based upon the fact whether or not you feel like that your game is dying out. I think that's what some people are also thinking about. I, for example, don't quite worry about League dying out anymore. It's been 8 years now. I mean, I guess 10 years at this point. It's been season 1, and we're in season 10. So I think that game is not dying out anytime soon, and it's still growing. It's still becoming something. But other games such as like Call of Duty, such as CS:GO, the releases come a bit faster than League, because League is a continuously updated game. So I understand why people would transfer to other games, because suddenly they see a financial incentive there or see a competitive incentive there where they want to transfer to be the very best at that very game for the short time period it's being up. So yeah, there's some incentive, but for League of Legends, I would say there's none basically.
All right. So I was going to ask something and on CS:GO. Do you see, for example, any correlation that helps someone to become a pro on esports in general? Like, for example, in CS:GO, the player skill can be transferred to other games with not much difference. For example, going from CS:GO now to Valorant. And for example, someone who plays League, that every 2 weeks you got a new patch with new stuff you need to adapt. How do you see the set of skills needed for someone to be in the pro level on esports in general, if that's even a thing?
I mean, what I say is pretty normal across all the esports. Is kind of hand-eye coordination, obviously. Then if it's a team sport, I think the team ability, so that means communication patterns, like for example, like, I mean, shot calling in my case, where you just call like how to play the game and the teammates follow. Then team behavior, like how do you build up a team, how do you communicate outside of the game. I think that's transferable. I would say, generally speaking, individual esport titles are really dissimilar. They're really different to the team esports. Like StarCraft, for example, if you take that as an example, I think the only real life like equivalent I can see is maybe chess, and even that is like really hard to kind of like compare. So I think the skills that you need in team sports, in team esports, you can actually transfer across most esports titles that are also teams, but like the individual ones are really, really different between one another. And I think like hand-eye coordination, I think, is amongst all of them. Team ability, like team coordination, is amongst all of them. And honestly, strategic thinking and problem solving is, I think, maybe that also like is across the board, where like in every esport you kind of have to think about, hey, how I'm gonna tackle this problem, how I'm gonna do this in this situation. And then pattern recognition, maybe. So what I mean by that is, like, for example, chess, you have like certain patterns that always repeat. And I think in esports sites you have the same. Like in CS:GO, you always know if for example, a grenade is being thrown there, then you know that this party is there. That's how you can, then you know how to position there in order to counter movement. And the same applies in League, where if I see someone there in this position and suddenly he's not in that position, then I can make a rotation happen, a movement happen. And I think that's like, maybe that's like something that's also across the esports titles.
I just came up with something that is out of the topics, but how do you see the hardships from going from a high level on a solo ladder in the game to the pro level? Because usually players on the solo ladder are playing solo or with someone else to go up, and then they get an invitation to participate on an academy team, for example, and they need to adapt to playing with a team with I think maybe with a completely different set of strategies. How does this transition from solo to team occur?
It's really, really hard. So what I've noticed, especially now that I became a coach and now reflecting on my own career, when I started out, I was really, I didn't understand the competitive game, and the competitive game flows in a different way. I think in basketball, you may see it similarly, like where, if you compare it to there, where like you have certain plays, I suppose, that are set, right? You have, for example, rotational plays that are like always in place. You always do the same thing. If X happens, then you have to do Y. And I think when players come in from solo queue, they're coming from like the solo game more or less. They rely mostly on their instincts. So that means their behavior patterns and their play patterns are based upon the fact that they played the game for so long and for so much that they basically just do the same thing over and over again in order to win games. And suddenly when they come to the competitive game, all those patterns that they've recognized and that they have memorized suddenly don't apply anymore. They have to completely play a different game. So the transition is actually pretty hard. Like the solo game is so vastly different to the competitive game that a lot of the skills, besides the mechanical ability, are not transferable. So you basically have to learn a whole nother skill set of League of Legends to become a competitive player.
All right. I think the next set of questions is Guilherme. Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, amazing. And going towards the Olympic part of our questions, I'm hoping to know what makes an esport for you.
I think an esport is made by basically having a game that is played on a competitive level, like being played in a competition. That's about it. Like I think there's nothing else besides that. I think like online chess can be an esport if people watch it. FIFA can be an esport if people watch it. NBA can be an esport if people watch it. I think as long as it's something that's being competitively done, I think it counts as an esport.
I was talking to Gabriel the other day, and we had a really nice discussion about speed running being in sports.
Yeah.
Do you feel like that too?
I mean, I think as long as people do decide to watch and really give an audience to it, I think it can be considered an esport. I just don't know how you would track speed running in terms of across multiple titles as an esport, because then it becomes really complicated. So I think it's more or less about, as long as it's within one title and you do the same thing all over and over again, I think then it's considered an esport.
Ok. Para quem está chegando agora, nós estamos aqui numa conversa com o Amazing, e nós temos aqui na nossa pauta essa questão da profissionalização do atleta, do cyberatleta, como é fazer a transição entre diferentes modalidades, e vocês podem mandar as suas perguntas aqui pelo chat, que nós vamos incluindo as ideias que forem surgindo ao longo da nossa discussão. Amazing. I would like to ask you about what do you think about the eSports participate on the Olympic program?
So, I mean, I think there are two schools of thought, at least for me. I think one of them would be, if we cannot make an exclusive eSport Olympics, then we have to be part of the normal Olympics. If we can make an eSport Olympics that is exclusive and that is not included in the actual Olympics, then we should run with that. I think for what I've seen the last couple of years and I guess the last 10 years almost, is that especially in traditional sports and traditional media is trying to get a hold of esports in some kind of way, and they're trying to control it in some kind of way, and they're trying to utilize their incentives in order to get a hold of it. So their incentives are usually backed by money. They want to get some kind of financial incentive out of it. They want to make sure that they take part of the cake. And I think we've grown esports has grown over the last, honestly, 20 years, maybe even individually and aside from what traditional sports are. So I think if we can make it happen, we should not try to include ourselves within the Olympics. We should try to make our own kind of subset of Olympic esports titles that we consider then basically our esports Olympics.
Now we are entering topics more related to sports in general and how the esport correlates with the Olympic, the normal sports.
Yeah.
And at first, Professor Katia was going to stay with us to bring up topics, but I think this is more of her and Raoni's area of study. So please bring some questions and things you want to ask more related to the sport and esport correlation in general. Raoni?
Yeah, I'm here. Well, hello, Maurice.
Hello.
Katia asked you about the relation between esports and the Olympic movement. To be an Olympic sports, required some kind of educational program. I don't know if you know something about Olympic education or...
Not as much. Not as much.
Yeah. My question for you, what do you think about the relation between electronic games or eSports in this topic, Olympic education or some kind of educational program using the electronic games as a, I don't like this word tool, but I think, like a tool for develop some kind of educational way.
I mean, using the Olympics to basically educate about esports is what you're asking, or if I understood
Yeah.
the question.
How can you? Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I think it would be. I mean, at least to make it mainstream, I think it would be a good idea to basically like give some kind of incentive to basically have other people watch esports and basically educate them through like the tool of, I suppose, the Olympics or otherwise. To basically make it more mainstream and to make it more understandable, especially for parents that see their kids game 24/7 and suddenly like realize, hey, this is actually something they do competitively. So maybe in that regard, it could be useful. And I think maybe utilizing the Olympics for that is actually useful too. So I think it's something one could consider. I do think that because esports are really like, I mean, certain esport titles are more fitting for that, I would suppose, than other esport titles. I think, for example, shooters, pretty hard to convey that. I think pretty hard to convey that to parents that this is a competitive title too, especially when it comes to like normal like sports, where, for example, in normal sports, like the worst that can happen is an accidental injury. Besides, like maybe I guess boxing, whatever, is where you kind of try to win by beating the other person, but you're not trying to kill him ever. And I think that's what kind of happens in esports titles usually. So maybe that could put people off. I would say, like, if you think about the esports titles that kind of are being used generally in the mainstream, it's like basically FIFA, I suppose, to a certain extent, and NBA is used to a certain extent. League of Legends is kind of narrowing that, but it's still kind of too brutal, I suppose. So I would say start small, have some normal esports titles such as FIFA, such as NBA being used to by kind of like, I suppose, bait people into watching more esports and then understanding it. And I think utilizing the Olympics as a tool for that, I think is a good thing. I think we just have to be sure that we don't use the most brutal ones yet, where we kind of honestly shock our audience, I suppose.
Yeah, thank
Okay.
you.
Oh, sorry.
Can I continue? Well, we spoke earlier about the new normal, and electronic games. I think it is a new normal, as you said before. So for this exact moment, I can say it by myself. I always like to play electronic games. They just play electronic games. And since April of this year, when the quarantine began, I start my career for racing driver. I really like to play racing games like iRacing or Gran Turismo. So for me,
that's a good game. Yeah.
So I already have 3 months of career,
nice.
Almost 4 months. So it's very nice. And what I see, my question is for League of Legends. Did you see something related to this in the the
play longer, I suppose. I think that's maybe the main difference. And electronic games, honestly, the benefit of them has always been the fact that you can basically play them within you basically don't have to have space, I suppose. You don't have to have certain conditions. The only thing you have to have is internet, a decent PC, so there's nothing else that you need. So you don't have to go out, you don't have to do anything, like you don't have to like basically build up a basketball court, for example, with a hoop, whatever it is, or a goal. There's nothing that forces you into these situations. So I think if it happens to be that this is the new normal where people are going to be more confined to spaces, I suppose esports will keep growing exponentially. And I think, at least in terms of like the activity levels amongst like other gamers and whatever, I've seen people that used to be like just part-time gamers now being full-time gamers, and people that were full-time gamers before basically sitting in front of the PCs 24/7 now. So I think maybe maybe within the normal, like esports is going to become the more dominant force within the sports world, I suppose.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now I have two questions about from Avelino Castro. The first one, how do you see the career for pro players? Is coaching is natural path? The second, what do you think if it's necessary for the community to do to sustain the environment of pro sport?
So to question one, I think it's not a natural path to become a coach after the esports career, because I do think you need a certain subset of skills that you don't quite learn as a player. I think for me, what I've always been doing throughout my career has basically been to be a shot caller, be a team helper almost, where I basically help other people to grow. I'm a shot caller, which means I basically tell them what to do in certain situations. So I kind of have that intrinsic in me. I think it's been something I've always had within me, and I think it's like it has become natural for me because it's a natural progression for myself because of the subset of skills I have. But for most other people, I don't think it's a viable like way to go. Like there are a lot of streamers, for example, that kind of like develop themselves out of the esports career. And I think that may be more natural, this outgoing style, especially nowadays where everyone is on Twitter, on social media, everyone talks a lot, everyone is so outgoing. So I think maybe that's more or less like normal. But I think coaching is pretty specific, I'd say. And to the question number two, what can people do to basically sustain esports? I think what they can do is simply watch it. I think that's all they can do. Play it, watch it, and then it will keep on growing. And the more you talk about it, the more people will know about it, and the more people will watch. So you support it by simply existing and participating, I suppose.
Thank you. It's you, Gabriel.
Okay, so let's see. What's my next question for you?
Bring it.
We got a bit lost. 1 second. So, oh, that's a cool one. It's a hook. So, what changed for you? Became a coach. What's like the biggest difference of being a player and then becoming a coach?
So, I think there are two things that kind of really stuck out to me in the last couple of weeks. So, as a coach, the amount of responsibility you have is a lot higher because you have to account for not just the 5 players, but also how they synergize, how they play together, how there's certain like individualisms, like as in like, you know, like everyone has their habits, everyone has their approaches, everyone has their different play styles, how they fit together, and you kind of have to like manage all of that. And then you have to understand, like based upon that, like where they are right now, you know, that how far do you want to make them grow? In which direction does each one of them have to grow? And I think as a player, I never had to worry about that. The only thing I had to worry about is like, hey, from my point of view, how do I make myself grow? And then like, hey, how do the other players grow together? You know, like that's the only thing. I didn't have to manage everyone individually and have to think about that as much. I think the second one is kind of like, yeah, the I guess it kind of plays into the first one, but it's like the thinking about the future. So as a player, I was always really in the moment. I always thought about, hey, the next game, like what we have to do, you know, that's it. And then like get another game in whatever it is. But as a coach, you can't do that. You have to think about long-term stretches, and you have to think about, hey, if I talk about this now, how will this impact my team for this week? Or if I don't bring this up now, will this become an issue in 2 weeks? So the distance of thought has basically like increased from maybe a couple of days to weeks or months at a time. And in the responsibility at hand too. So I have to think, hey, is this guy going to be a good fit for my team next year, for example, or if this guy is going to be a good fit for my team this year? So I kind of feel like I don't know if you guys ever played Football Manager or whatever it is. It's like kind of the same thing where, oh, if I do put this guy in for another 10 minutes, it's like instead of subbing him out at 85, I'm going to sub him out at 80 already. You know, how will this change his mindset? How will this change his play? Will he score as many goals? Like this kind of thing that I'm thinking about now. And I think that has really changed for me. I've become more responsible, I would say, and more future oriented. I think, yeah.
Okay. And what was like your biggest challenge as a coach? Like the biggest problem you had to deal with?
I think disrespect from the players, because people don't quite understand what it means to be like, and that's kind of the challenge we talked about earlier, where when it come from the solo queue scene more or less, or from a lower scene to basically to the real competitive scene. So there's a huge difference between not even the solo queue and the LEC, but also like national leagues such as the French league to the LEC. And then again, like you have to think about that everyone comes in from different experiences. So this guy from another team may come in and it's like, oh, this is how I always did it, and suddenly you don't agree with that, and you still have to implement that. So I think managing expectations of players and managing their personalities has been the biggest challenge. And recently, obviously, because of our losing streak to a certain extent, managing the motivation and the discipline of players. Like people get really undisciplined or unmotivated when they see like failures happen time after time, and you have to manage that, and you have to figure out how to motivate them. How do I get them on the same page again? And that was actually like something I had to deal with today, where kind of had to make a big speech about like what we're going to do right now, how do we fix this, and leaving my own ego aside, like how do I help those people and how to make them better, like. And I think that's a kind of, you have to think about what they need and not what they want to a certain extent too, because if we're all like real to ourselves, like we're all lazy, we're all like, every one of us has like something inside of them that tells them don't do anything, just stay at home, play PC games all day, whatever it is. But we still have to motivate ourselves. And I think then, especially players that come with that mindset, you have to give them what they need, not what they want. So that may mean that you have to be really hard on them, even though it hurts yourself. So that's something I had to deal with recently.
All right. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks, Maurice.
I'm sorry. We got a few more questions here. Mostly asking about the difference between a major region to a minor region. Let's say there were some questions regarding connection, about payment, and I mean you participated on many international events. You played with people from all over the world. So how can you tell what you noticed playing with those people? I mean, from playing with North America, Europe, Korea, China, with what's the major difference you see regarding posture, strategy, and things like this?
So I'm going to start with the first question, like the minor and major leagues. I think the main difference between minor and major leagues is simply the infrastructure. I think that's what it is. Like it's gaming houses, it's salary, everything like that is like basically just less developed, because it's a trickle down effect, right? Whatever happens at the top, like will then be transferred like at a lower rate to bottom, like further down. And then at some point you have the solo queue again, So like it's basically a trickle down effect. So minor leagues basically just the different infrastructure, and they keep catching up. So the difference is not as high as it used to be. It's getting narrower and narrower, but there's still a huge difference in terms of salary, in terms of like gaming houses, in terms of coaching quality, and in terms of player quality. That's just what it is. From the main difference between the players from the specific regions. So each region has kind of their own approach to not just league, and I think it's more about life. I think that's more important part. So Koreans are really used to having this high hierarchy system where there's like basically they respect the elderly a lot. They respect the everyone that is like a year older than you is already Hyung, which basically means that he's like your big brother to a certain extent, and you have to pour like his water when you go out to eat with them and that kind of thing. So that means like they're going to be really respectful to people with more experience than them. So that means they're more used to being led to a certain extent, but they're also really used to work really hard because they've always had to prove themselves versus other people. And the environment that Korea is in, for example, higher in stress than any other environment that I've seen in the world, maybe besides Japan and China, where like the to be really competitive, to have to work for everything that they do. So in terms of strategy, that also reflects itself where they're really good at pressing buttons. They're really good at like doing the mechanical stuff, which is what we call it, like the mechanical ability. They're really good at understanding that, but they're less incentivized to be individuals, which means that they don't think about the game as much on a team level scale. So they don't really try to become shot callers, whatever. They just try to be good at pressing buttons and then having their coach tell them what to do. So in China, that's kind of similar. I think in China you have the similar pattern. I think North America, the stardom that is really present in the mindset of a lot of people is actually misleading them. And I think in North America, the issue is that the most money and the most success actually lies not within playing the best, but actually streaming the most, like having the most fans and having the most people watch you. So what that means is that like people are going to be less focused on actually being good at the game and like really trying hard, but really are going to try to rise to that stardom. And I think the whole American dream is kind of playing into that. So like the mindset in America is just, despite the fact that it's always about like, hey, if you work hard, you're going to get far. It's more about if you work hard, you're going to get a lot of money. And people are not going to be incentivized to actually try as hard as possible to win games, but rather to be as marketable as possible and thus make the most money for the organizations or for themselves. In Europe, depending on the country, but I think overall it's pretty similar, because of the fact that we've had such flat hierarchies throughout the year, like throughout the last 100 years, I think to a certain extent, like maybe not 100 years, but the last 50 years at least, especially, that like people are not that used to like basically having like so many superiors. So you question authority a lot. Like that's what we used to, because we have to, because of our like history to a certain extent. We have to think about like what are other people doing like above us. So we're always in this questioning mindset, which means that we're never going to be satisfied with someone just telling us what to do. So all of the Europeans are really competitive because they try to be the best players that they can be and know the most that they can do, simply because they don't trust anyone above them to do the work for them. So I think that is like really different to other cultures, and I think European mindsets are kind of really prevailing right now, I suppose, in esports. And a lot of European teams are really good at the game because of it. For Brazil, for example, or like for South America, I can't really talk, I suppose. But what I've seen is that passion really drives them. Passion has been something where, like, I mean, maybe it's like kind of this Rick Spater, like kind of mindset, where it's like from the rags to the riches to a certain extent, where like a lot of people like may have come up in like not in poverty, but like not in the best conditions, and suddenly have to work for their money to that extent. And once they have it, they really respect that effort that is being put in. They respect everyone that has this mindset to just do the best for the teammates. So I think, yeah, depending on the culture, it really changes the mindset of the players and their ability to actually influence the team positively.
Very good.
Vai, Guilherme.
It's a question from Yuri Skremin. He's asking if in your ongoing career, if you thought sometime about the reconciliation with formal education.
So basically, if I wanted to get a proper education, or what was the question?
If you thought about finishing or beginning again university, and
I mean,
I've from sports. Sorry,
I definitely have thought about it, and I think maybe if I wasn't as comfortable living right now as I am, I would probably consider it more. But I honestly feel like within the realm of esports, I have a pretty good reputation so far, and there's certain things I can do at this point that I think qualify me for further jobs within the industry. So I don't worry about it as much. But for me, what has always been interesting is actually psychology, for example. Psychology, sports psychology has been really interesting to me, because I do think there's a lot in that to basically help other people grow, and especially as a coach, that should be an incentive for me to help other people grow. So yeah, esports psychology, sports psychology and psychology in general would be something I would consider doing. And in order to finish my education, I suppose, it's also a sense of pride. I think a lot of people don't quite understand that like having a certain amount of education actually gives you a certain amount of level within society that you feel that you have achieved. It gives you security. It gives you it gives you the security to basically know that no matter what happens, you still have something to fall back upon. So I think for a lot of people, it should actually be the incentive to do. Maybe for me, I'm also 26 at this point, so maybe going back right now would be a bit of a waste, I suppose. But we'll never know. I think I'm definitely thinking about it.
Just making a hook. Professor Katia has an specialization in sports psychology.
Nice.
Yes, and there is a very good, very nice question about the psychological question with you, Gabriel.
It's a question from Matheus Felipe. Do you think that there's a difference between the teams that invest in a psychological preparation before the games from those who doesn't, and if it's noticeable?
Yeah, I do think that it's noticeable, and I think the main difference for teams that invest in psychology and in sports psychology, I guess in general, is that they're mentally tougher and they're more resilient to outside influences. Like usually when you come to a season and you play 9 weeks or even 13 weeks, considering like you have to also think of the preparation that is like a month, like 13 weeks of people being in the same room almost, like obviously they're going back home to sleep, whatever it is, in their separate rooms, but like they do sit on top of one another for 13 weeks at a time. And if you don't have someone to talk to, if you don't have someone that coordinates that, if you don't have someone that kind of like pushes certain conversations into a certain direction, a lot of like frustration will build up over the months and weeks. And if you don't address it, it's only going to get worse. So I think esports psychologists and psychologists in general help that a lot. I also think that like when you think about traditional sports, there's been like a lot of like influence on like and especially like help with mental health, and esports is no different. It requires that too. I think sports psychologists per se are not as efficient as real psychologists, I suppose, because there's still a difference, right, in terms of what they studied. So I think psychologists in general may be better for more people, because also, and that may sound weird, but a lot of esports players, they don't become esports players because they're, I suppose, happy people. They become esports players because they kind of like isolate themselves from society for a specific amount of time and suddenly become good at a video game. And I think we have to respect that and honestly address that too. And I think that's where psychologists, more so than sports psychologists, come into play and help out the players. So yeah, there's a huge difference. And I think a lot of players that have been playing for a long time have been addressing therapy and have been addressing like psychologists in a more serious manner than people that have not been playing for a long time.
And in this direction, and the physical preparation.
Oh yeah, that is pretty huge. So at this point, people do work out a lot. I think, at least for example, we have a mandatory like workout schedule, but even in North America, for example, you see like, I mean, I think Svenskeren and Golden Glue, which are really popular players, they're called the Swole Bros, and they're even featured in, I think, in Men's Health or in the GQ, something like that. So it's like it has taken a different turn now, where I suppose we're still nerds, but we're now working out and we're actually trying as hard as possible to basically strengthen our back, strengthen our like basically our core in order to be able to perform at the highest level. And there's so much research about it right now that even like exercising between games, right, basically reactivates your frontal lobe to basically be more receptive towards like new stimuli. And I think if you go against research, well, that's your issue, but a lot of teams don't, and they actually go with the research and they actually make sure that sports and team sports become part of the routine.
We got a question. For you, what makes a game good? Game in a sense that not the match, the game as a general, like leagues.
Oh, the eSport title. Okay.
Yeah.
So what I think it makes good, at least on a personal level, I really like games where there's a lot of clarity within what you're doing. So basically, I don't like games with hidden things. So, and what I mean by that, for example, League of Legends, which is why I've disliked League of Legends a bit more nowadays than before, is that there's less clarity about what certain spells do. So you don't quite know what's going to hit you. In basketball, for example, if you throw someone the ball, then you know you're going to receive the pass. But and if you shoot a hoop from 3-point line, you're going to make it's going to be 3 points. And I think that's kind of the clarity that esports need. I do think that there just has to be interactive. There just has to be fun, I suppose, too. Like there has to be something that's like engaging. There has to be something that like makes people like tied to the game. But yeah, I don't prefer. There's no aspect for me that like I guess like really sticks out, because I don't mind if it's a team sport or not a team sport. I think even solo esports can be engaging. I, for example, am a really huge fan of RTSs, which is something like StarCraft, which is something like Age of Empires, I suppose. Like these kind of games are really engaging to me. But yeah, like any game has to be really engaging and fun and transparent, I suppose, to be a good esport title or to be a good game in general, I suppose.
Okay. Now with more of the not too comfortable questions. Question in this case. What most people know is that toxicity is a common theme on online communities, games, social platforms, everything. People feel safe, so they also feel safe to harass people. And do you see any ways that games can develop good values on people, like make them better instead of toxic, for example?
Yeah, so I would say that a lot of games do have really positive influences on people. Like I think the problem solving that I talked about earlier, like even in the influence, like even certain values that right now are being pushed by multiple esports organizations and everything that kind of help that. I think you cannot quite get rid of the toxicity unless you basically get rid of the anonymous like nature of any kind of like game, of any kind of like, I know, social media platform too. Like for example, in Korea, they kind of solved this issue by tying your social security number to League of Legends, to your League of Legends account. So if you're toxic in game, what can happen is that suddenly you get a notification, especially as an esports player, hey, you've been toxic, you've been really harassing people, that this is not how you can do it, and suddenly you have to do 20 hours of community service because you've been harassing people online. So I mean, I don't know if you want to go that far, because in terms of internet policing and everything like that, but that's like one solution to it. So if you want to get rid of like the toxicity and basically decrease it, you have to get rid of the anonymous nature. But yeah, like good values are always being pushed. There's so many things that we have to that are good about esports and good about like games in general. Like, I mean, if we think about Pokemon, what has Pokemon like kind of given us? It's like this, how to take care of like I suppose a pet to a certain extent, even Tamagotchi, like as stupid as it sounds. There's so many things that like certain games basically push in terms of good values that we have to respect too. So online games just are a new frontier, and we have to really manage that. But it's the same as with social media, right? It's like something that is, because of the anonymous nature, it's just inherently dangerous. Until we resolve that, I don't think we can completely absolve ourselves of the like potential toxicity that comes with it.
Maurice, in our discussions, we try to close Olympic sports and esports. This morning we have a long speech about values on Olympics and values on esports.
Yeah.
Could you see how the most important values in esports?
Yeah, so what I think the most important values in esports are, first of all, inclusivity. And what that means is basically everyone that wants to participate can participate. There's no barrier, right? As long as you have a mouse, keyboard, you have a PC, or you have a controller and like a console, you're fine. You're good to go. Like any 17-year-old can play with a 30-year-old, 50-year-old, 60-year-old, right? They can play together. They can compete against one another. If you're male, female, or other, you can compete in esports. So there's no barrier within that, right? So I think that's like number one. I think second off would probably be actually that's a good actually Boston. I actually don't quite know what is like basically maybe it's just the competition itself. I think obviously competition is always something that's like a relative like virtue for any kind of like sports or esports. But yeah, like I think inclusivity is probably the major one. I think that's maybe the one that I will push the most and think about the most.
Hello?
Yeah.
Let's see. The topic of values and games it's like a really hard topic to discuss. I'm doing my
it depends on the game too, right? It depends on the game. For example, like I mean, if it's on esports title, for example, Pokemon, what kind of value does this push, right? It's like take care of your pets to a certain extent, make sure they're happy, don't let them die, right? Like that's something you can transfer to real life too. So I think esports maybe is just a bit more difficult because what are you going to get out of CS:GO, for example? What are you going to get out of it? Well, the virtue is that kill the other team. Like, is that something you wanna think about in real life? Not really. You don't want that. So I think you have to be like almost like an outside create an outside perspective. And the only thing I can see that is like basically across the board is like inclusivity, competition, and teamwork. I suppose I think teamwork is a good one.
Definitely teamwork and friendship.
Yeah.
Okay, we have more questions. With you, Gabriel?
Yeah. So we
From
Saul Oliveira, and he's asking you about the amount of hours of practice that the athletes are like have to practice, and what are your opinions on like how far can you push them, and dedication of like the dedication pays off.
I would add something else, something more to that question. On how is the individual and the team training divided in this case?
Yeah. So in terms of team practice, I mean, I'm gonna reveal our schedule. So our schedule starts like this: at 12 to 1 p.m. we basically have a team lunch. We can go together and like eat together. Then at 1 we have a meeting to 2 p.m. where we basically like talk about like what we want to do for the day, what kind of strategies we want to develop. And then from 2 p.m. to like 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. so basically 5 to 6 games we practice together. So that's like a 6-hour period or 7-hour period in which case we actually are together as a team, right? Where we practice together, we talk together, we develop together. I think past that point, it's upon the individual to basically create his own or to harness his own abilities. So that means he has to practice for at least like another 2-3 hours. So I would say, generally speaking, a normal day is 10 hours. If you want to push yourself, it's 12 hours. And if you want to be insane and really someone that can be remembered for a long time and be the very best at the game, you honestly don't really have a life. I'm going to be honest here. There's no talking around it, but I think it's not dissimilar to real sports. When you think about like an example like Kobe, right? Kobe Bryant, like, I mean, recently died, but like there's so much about him that he talked about and what he did in order to become the very best. And he really had no life. There was nothing that he had going for him besides like basically the game of basketball. And I think in esports, it's not different. Where if you want to be the very best, if you want to be the top 1% of the 1% of the 1% of the 1%, you have to put in the work, and it's 14 to 16 hours. I don't quite support it anymore. I don't think it's holistic at all, and I think you probably burn yourself out. So I think generally speaking, 10 hours is kind of like what I think the average pro player does every day. So that's kind of like a 70-hour week, 60 to 70-hour week.
And the last one, Braulio Marx asked, do you see the sport as a cultural practice globally accepted in terms of gender and age? Is there any region in the world where it is not forested?
So I would still say that, like, I mean, I don't think that women are really that included in esport yet, but honestly, it may just be because of how weird the anonymous nature of the internet is. As soon as like someone knows you're a woman, a girl in esport, or not even esport, but just in gaming in general, I think you're kind of being harassed to a certain extent. So I think it's not that inclusive in that regard. Albeit, I think on esports level, especially with the organizations pushing for it, girls again can participate in their found their own kind of women's leagues and whatever it is. So I don't think they're being harassed there anymore. I would say past a certain point, your reflexes kind of like turn down. So there's been research that kind of indicates that like around the age of 30, afterwards, your reflexes are kind of like taking a dip and they're declining by 1% every single year. So technically speaking, you could still play until you're 40, but you're most likely going to have to work harder than someone that is 25. That's just how it is. So age plays a factor. It's not as major as people make it out to be, but there's definitely a factor there. And the second part of the question, what was that again?
What?
The next part was, is there any region in the world that not fostered esports that you know of?
That doesn't really support it? Is that the question, basically?
Yeah, yes.
So I would say, I mean, it feels like that the most players actually come from China and Korea. So I think those regions have really, really supported it. Surprisingly, what I've not seen, I mean, obviously, Africa actually seems to be something that doesn't really harness like esports at all or supports it, but that may just because of the economic like, differences in the country. So maybe that's just the problem. I think any region of the world that is more rural, like something like maybe even mainland China, something maybe like India is actually surprising to me, where I don't quite understand why India doesn't really have that many esports teams, because India is a huge country and they do have a relatively decent infrastructure in at least in the big cities. So maybe that's kind of weird. But culturally, I think there's still a lot of difference between the certain like countries, even in Europe. Germany, for example, it's not really mainstream yet. Like Germany has a ton of like esports players, but I don't think it's socially acceptable or like socially like encouraged to be an esports player. I think that's what we find like across the globe, where in North America, in at least like in the US, they really celebrate it. Here in Germany, they're kind of ridiculed. In France, that may be the same, but it's already getting there. So it's just regional differences. But yeah, like certain continents are still not quite there, but that is just because of the economic differences and the fact that you basically need a really good infrastructure to actually compete at the highest level in esports.
Muito bem. Para quem nos acompanha aqui no canal Olimpiar e pelo Facebook do Grupo de Estudos Olímpicos da Universidade de São Paulo, essa é uma conversa, é um diálogo bastante importante nesse momento. A gente está acompanhando aqui pelo chat. Quem nos acompanhou sabe da importância do Amazing como jogador no cenário internacional, mas mais do que tudo, a competência, a capacidade de conversar sobre diferentes tópicos que envolvem o esporte eletrônico, a carreira de atleta, a dimensão do esporte para a sociedade atual. Enfim, thank you, Amazing.
Thank you for having me.
Really amazing this live.
Thank you.
And I'm really happy with the discussion. Our audience like a lot the discussion. Your competence to talking about different topics in the esports and in general. Thank you very much. And if you, Toshi, Gabriel, Guilherme, Raoni, if you want to talk any question, we are finishing this live.
I actually have a more personal question. What will you think will happen to the international competitions this year because of quarantine and stuff?
Depends on how much I can give. I still do think that at least in terms of international competition for most esports sites, what they're going to do is similar to what the NBA is doing right now, which means they're going to put them in a bubble. So basically fly the teams in, you have them isolate for like 7 to 14 days, and then you basically have them like play in a hotel together, right? So I think that's a solution that a lot of teams are a lot of like esports sites will probably be going for.
Okay. Does anyone else have any more questions?
Well, for me, it's okay. Just say it's a really pleasure to talk to you. Amazing.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here, guys.
As Katia said, it was amazing.
Thank you, Maurice, for your time. Thank you for being with us and discussing all of it.
Thank you for the questions. Like, it was really, really fun and interesting, to be fair.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Have a good day, everyone, or good evening, whatever it is.
Good evening. Yeah. Good evening.
Goodbye.
Thank you, amazing. Good luck in this week games.
Thank you. Bye.
Encerrou?